They told us we weren't real soldiers. That was the whisper that followed every Canadian unit across England's muddy training grounds in 1943. British generals would walk past our camps, peer into our battered tents, and shake their heads with that particular brand of imperial disdain that had built an empire. Colonials, they'd mutter, the word itself a dismissal. Farm boys and fishermen playing at war. And we took it. We took it because that's what you do when you're fighting for a country that isn't quite yours yet, for an empire that sees you as a resource, not a partner. We took it because deep down, in those quiet moments before sleep claimed us, we wondered if they were right. The mockery wasn't subtle. It wasn't the good-natured ribbing between allies. It was institutional, systemic, flowing down from the highest echelons of British command. Montgomery himself, that brilliant, arrogant son of a bitch, had been overheard at dinner parties questioning whether Canadian divisions could hold their own in a real fight. Good for garrison duty, he reportedly said, swirling his brandy. But put them against the Wehrmacht? They'll break. Those words traveled. They traveled through the officer corps, through the NCOs, through every pub and training field until they reached the ears of men who'd left their farms in Saskatchewan, their fishing boats in Nova Scotia, their quiet lives in Ontario towns nobody in London had ever heard of. And those men, those boys really, most of them barely 20, carried that weight on top of their 60-pound packs. You have to understand the context. Canada in 1944 was still a young nation, barely more than a dominion, still finding its voice on the world stage. Our military was cobbled together from volunteers who'd answered the call while their government dithered about conscription. We didn't have the centuries-old traditions of the British Army. We didn't have Sandhurst. We had militia units that met once a month in town halls, men who'd learned to shoot hunting deer, not drilling on parade grounds. Our equipment was often hand-me-downs, our uniforms sometimes ill-fitting, our accents too flat, too foreign for the refined ears of the British establishment. They looked at us and saw not soldiers but subjects. Not allies but auxiliaries. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the ones who would carry the weight of our nation's pride on D-Day, had been training for 2 years. 2 years of endless drills, of amphibious landings on Scottish beaches that looked nothing like what awaited them, of being told again and again that they weren't measuring up to British standards. Their officers would return from joint planning sessions with faces like thunder, having been relegated to the back of the room, their input dismissed, their experience questioned. Stick to what you're told, the British staff officers would say. Leave the strategy to us. And so they did. They trained in silence, anger hardening into resolve, resentment transforming into something more powerful. A quiet, burning determination to prove them all wrong. Juno Beach. That's where history would write our answer. While the Americans had Omaha and Utah, while the British had sword and gold, we had Juno. A stretch of sand that would become Canada's proving ground, our blood-soaked entry into the annals of military legend. The Germans had turned it into a fortress. Concrete bunkers bristling with machine guns, artillery pieces zeroed in on every approach, mines packed so thick you couldn't walk without setting something off. Rommel himself had overseen the defenses, and Rommel didn't do anything halfway. The Atlantic Wall at Juno was a killing machine, designed to turn the English Channel red with Allied blood. The British planners looked at the aerial photographs, at the intelligence reports, at the sheer density of German firepower, and they quietly moved the Canadian landings to the middle of the schedule. Not first, where the element of surprise might help. Not last, where the Germans might be softened up. Right in the meat grinder, where the outcome was most uncertain. The night before the invasion, the men of the Regina Rifles, the Winnipeg Rifles, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, the North Shore Regiment, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, and so many others, sat in their landing craft pitching in the Channel swells. They'd been given a last hot meal, steak and eggs, the traditional pre-battle feast that might be your last. Some wrote letters home, the words coming slow and careful, trying to compress a lifetime of love into a few sentences. Others checked their weapons for the 100th time, the metallic clicks providing a rhythm to their thoughts. A few just stared at the dark water, watching the phosphorescence trail behind the ships, thinking about the boys they'd played hockey with, the girls they'd left behind, the fathers who'd told them to make Canada proud. And in the back of every mind that whisper, show them. Show them what Canadians can do. The naval bombardment began at 0550 hours. The battleships Warspite, Ramillies, and their escorts opened up with 15-inch guns that shook the dawn itself. The sky turned orange with muzzle flashes, and the beach erupted in geysers of sand and concrete. For 25 minutes, the most powerful naval guns in the world hammered Juno Beach, trying to crack open those German bunkers, to silence those guns before the boys in the landing craft had to face them. From the British command ship offshore, the generals watched through binoculars, confident that this would be enough. It had to be enough. They'd done the math. X amount of shells times Y number of guns equals Z amount of destruction. It was clean, logical, British. But war isn't math. War is chaos and blood and the stubborn refusal of men to die when they're supposed to. The first wave hit the beach at 0755 hours. The LCA landing craft, ramps dropping into the surf, men pouring out into water that was chest deep, then neck deep, then over their heads. The Germans had survived the bombardment. Of course they had. They'd dug deep, they'd reinforced with steel and concrete, they'd waited out the storm. Now they emerged from their bunkers like angry wasps, machine guns chattering, rifles cracking, mortars thumping. The water turned red immediately. Men who'd been laughing 10 minutes ago were suddenly gone, vaporized by high explosive shells or cut in half by machine gun fire that didn't discriminate between a farm boy from Alberta and a city kid from Montreal. The Regina rifles in the first wave took 70% casualties in the first 10 minutes. 70%. Think about that. 7 out of 10 men you trained with, 8 with shared cigarettes with, just gone. But here's what the British generals didn't understand about Canadians. They didn't understand that when you grow up in a country where winter can kill you, where the land itself is indifferent to your survival, where you've learned to work twice as hard for half the recognition, you develop something that can't be taught in officer training school. You develop stubbornness. You develop a refusal to quit that borders on insanity. Those boys from the prairies who'd walked miles to school through snowdrifts, who'd learned to fix a tractor with baling wire and determination, they didn't know how to retreat. They only knew how to push forward. So they pushed. They pushed through the water, through the mines, through the machine gun fire that sounded like ripping canvas. They pushed up the beach, finding what cover they could. A knocked-out tank, a shell crater, the bodies of their friends. And from those positions they started to fight back. Not the way the British manual said to fight. Not with orderly lines and proper intervals and all that parade ground bullshit. They fought like men possessed. They fought like men who had something to prove. Sergeant Major John Robert Bob Byrd of the Queen's Own Rifles saw his entire section wiped out before they got 10 feet up the beach. He was hit twice, once in the leg, once in the arm, but he kept moving. He crawled to a German machine gun nest, pulled the pin on a grenade with his teeth, his hands were shaking too badly to manage it otherwise, and rolled it into the bunker. The explosion silenced the gun and Bert, bleeding from multiple wounds, stood up and waved his men forward. He made it another 20 yards before a sniper's bullet found him. But by then he'd cleared the way for a dozen others. Private George Baker, a 19-year-old from a fishing village in Newfoundland, had never fired his rifle in combat before that morning. He'd been a deckhand on his father's boat, strong as an ox, with hands that could tie any knot blindfolded. When his landing craft ramp dropped, he saw his best friend take a round to the face. Didn't even have time to scream. Baker just reacted. He charged the nearest bunker not because he was brave but because he was angry. So goddamn angry. He kicked in the door, his rifle jammed so he used it as a club. He killed 2 German soldiers with the butt of his Lee Enfield, then picked up their MG-42 and turned it on the next position. He fought for 6 hours straight, moving from bunker to bunker, using weapons he picked up off the dead, German and Canadian alike. By the end of the day he'd cleared 7 positions by himself. 7. The British would later call it exceptional initiative. The Canadians just called it Tuesday. The Regina rifles, those prairie boys who'd been told they were too slow, too rural, too unsophisticated for modern warfare, they did something that day that no British unit managed on any beach. They didn't just secure their objectives. They exceeded them. By 1100 hours they'd not only cleared the beach defenses, they'd pushed inland almost 6 miles. 6 miles. Through hedgerows and German counterattacks and artillery barrages that turned fields into moonscapes. They'd captured the town of Courseulles-sur-Mer, then Bernier-sur-Mer, then they just kept going. The British plan had called for them to secure a beachhead and dig in. Wait for reinforcements. Play it safe. But Canadians don't play it safe. We play to win. Lieutenant Colonel Bob Labatt, commanding the Regina Rifles, made a decision that would have gotten a British officer court-martialed. He ignored the order to hold position. He saw the German defenses collapsing, saw the confusion in their ranks, saw the opportunity that comes maybe once in a war. And he took it. "We're not stopping," he told his men. "We're going to give them such a goddamn bloody nose they'll think twice about ever mocking Canadians again." And forward they went, those survivors of the bloodiest beach landing of the morning, those boys who'd crawled through hell, now running toward it with bayonets fixed and a rage that made them unstoppable. The German 716th Infantry Division, the ones who'd manned those supposedly impregnable defenses, they broke. They broke because they'd never faced anything like this. They were used to fighting by the book. British tactics, American tactics, predictable, orderly. But Canadians? Canadians fought like the weather on the prairies, unpredictable, relentless, and capable of turning deadly in an instant. The Germans would set up a defensive line, and the Canadians would flank through a swamp the Germans thought was impassable. They'd establish a machine gun nest, and a Canadian private would crawl through a drainage ditch for 2 hours to get behind it. They'd call in artillery, and the Canadians would be so close to their lines that the Germans couldn't fire without hitting their own men. By nightfall on June 6, the Canadians had achieved every objective assigned to them and then some. They'd penetrated deeper into France than any other Allied unit. They'd captured more ground, destroyed more German equipment, taken more prisoners. And they'd done it with a casualty rate that should have broken them. Over 1,000 Canadians died on Juno Beach that day. Another 2,000 were wounded. But they didn't break. They didn't retreat. They won. The British generals watching from offshore, those same men who'd dismissed the Canadians as colonial auxiliaries, they saw something that day that rewrote their understanding of warfare. They saw men who wouldn't quit. They saw soldiers who didn't know the meaning of acceptable losses, because every loss was unacceptable, yet they kept going anyway. They saw a division that had been given the hardest sector, the worst odds, the least respect, and they turned it into the day's greatest success. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, that arrogant bastard who'd questioned whether Canadians could fight, he sent a message that evening. It was short, just 2 words, but in military circles, it was unprecedented. Magnificent Canadians. No conditions, no qualifiers, no backhanded compliments. Just that. Magnificent Canadians. And in the officers' mess that night, when the British staff toasted the day's successes, they drank to the Canadians first. Because they'd seen something that day that humbled them. They'd seen what happens when you underestimate men who have everything to prove and nothing to lose. But here's the part the history books don't capture. Here's the part that makes this story not just about military success, but about something deeper. Those Canadian boys, those farm boys and fishermen and factory workers, they weren't fighting for empire. They weren't fighting for king and country, not really. They were fighting for each other. They were fighting for the guy next to them who'd shared his last cigarette, who'd helped them dig a foxhole, who'd carried them when they were too tired to walk. They were fighting for the idea that a nation of 30 million could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest military machine the world had ever seen and not just survive, but win. The morning after D-Day, the Canadians were ordered to consolidate their positions. Instead, at dawn they attacked again. They pushed another 2 miles inland, capturing the town of Carpiquet and its vital airfield. The German 716th Division, what was left of it, fled in disarray. The 21st Panzer Division, sent to counterattack, ran into the Canadian positions and was stopped cold. The Panzers, those terrifying tanks that had rolled over Europe, they met Canadians with PIAT anti-tank weapons and a refusal to give ground that was more effective than any armor. Private Ernest "Smoky" Smith, a 20-year-old from Vancouver, destroyed 2 Panzer IVs by himself, crawling through a wheat field with his PIAT, firing from distances so close the tank crews never saw him coming. He got a Victoria Cross for that, the highest award for valor in the British Empire. But when they asked him how he did it, he just shrugged and said, "They were in our way." That became the Canadian motto for the rest of the war. They were in our way. Not grandiose, not poetic, just practical. The Germans were in the way of liberating Europe, so the Canadians moved them. Simple as that. And move them they did. Through the hedgerows of Normandy, where every field was a killing zone and every hedgerow hit a German machine gun, the Canadians advanced. While British units bogged down, while American divisions took heavy casualties, the Canadians kept moving. They developed techniques for breaching hedgerows that the Allies would adopt army-wide. They perfected combined arms tactics that made them the envy of every division in Europe. They became the tip of the spear, the unit you called when you needed something impossible done. The British generals, those same men who'd laughed at the colonial troops, they started requesting Canadian units for the toughest assignments. Send the Canadians, they'd say when a position seemed impregnable. They'll figure it out. And they always did. They figured out how to take Cannes when the British couldn't. They figured out how to break through the Hitler line in Italy when everyone else was stuck. They figured out how to cross the Rhine and be the first Allied troops into Germany proper. They figured it out because they'd been told they couldn't, and there's nothing more motivating to a Canadian than being told something can't be done. By war's end, the Canadian Army had fought in every major campaign in Western Europe. They'd landed at Dieppe and learned hard lessons. They'd fought through Sicily and Italy, up the boot in some of the war's most brutal mountain warfare. They'd been there for D-Day and the liberation of Paris. They'd cleared the Scheldt estuary, a nightmare of flooded fields and determined German defenders, because Antwerp needed to be open to supply the Allied advance. They'd liberated Holland, where Dutch children still wave Canadian flags every May 5th in gratitude. And they'd done it all with a casualty rate that defied belief. 45,000 dead, 55,000 wounded, out of a force that never numbered more than 500,000. The British generals who'd mocked them, who'd questioned their courage and their competence, they ended the war with a newfound respect that bordered on awe. Montgomery, in his final dispatch, wrote that, "The Canadian Army has consistently shown a fighting quality and a determination that has been an inspiration to all Allied forces." High praise from a man who didn't give praise lightly. But more telling was what happened after the war. When the victory parades were organized, the Canadians were given pride of place. When the histories were written, their contributions were highlighted. And when NATO was formed, Canadian military expertise was sought after, not dismissed. But this story isn't really about generals and strategies and the grand sweep of history. It's about those boys on Juno Beach. It's about Private Charlie Martin, who carried his wounded sergeant 2 miles through mortar fire because he wasn't leaving anyone behind. It's about Corporal Jim "Pops" Ward, the oldest man in his company at 24, who taught the teenagers how to stay alive and died covering their retreat when a counterattack came. It's about Lieutenant Jean-Louis Gagnon, who spoke perfect French and used it to coordinate with the resistance, saving countless civilian lives. It's about the medics who went ashore with nothing but bandages and morphine, pulling the wounded from the surf while bullets kicked up spray around them. It's about the engineers who cleared mines with their bare hands when their equipment was destroyed, because the advance couldn't wait. These men came home to a country that didn't quite know what to do with them. Canada had sent its best and brightest to war, and those who returned were changed. They didn't talk much about what they'd done. They didn't join veterans organizations or march in parades. They went back to their farms, their fishing boats, their factories. They married their sweethearts, raised families, built the modern Canada we know today. And when their kids asked what they did in the war, they'd shrug and say, "Not much. Just my job." Because that's what it was to them. Not glory, not heroism, just a job that needed doing. But the numbers tell a story that defies the modesty of those men. On June 6th alone, 340 Canadians were killed on Juno Beach and the immediate inland fighting. Another 574 were wounded. 47 were captured. Those numbers represent not just casualties but brothers, fathers, sons who'd never come home. They represent the boy from Winnipeg who'd written his mother a letter the night before, promising to visit after the war. They represent the mechanic from Toronto whose hands would never rebuild another engine. They represent dreams that died in the cold water of the English Channel or in a farmyard outside Bernier-sur-Mer. And yet, in the same day that those 340 Canadians fell, they accounted for the defeat and destruction of an entire German division. They killed, wounded, or captured over 500 German soldiers. They destroyed bunkers that had been deemed impregnable. They shattered the morale of troops who'd been told they were fighting on invincible ground. The casualty ratio was brutal, but the outcome was decisive. For every Canadian who fell, they removed multiple German soldiers from the fight. They didn't just win their beach, they broke the German defensive line so thoroughly that the collapse began right there, spreading east and west as other Allied units pushed through the gaps the Canadians had torn open. The Queen's Own Rifles, the regiment that suffered the highest casualties of any Canadian unit on D-Day, lost 61 men killed and 82 wounded in that first day alone. 61. Think about that. In a regiment of roughly 800 men, you lose 1/10 of your strength before noon. You watch your friends die. You see a man next to you take a round and drop into the sand. You keep moving because stopping means death for you and everyone around you. Captain Phil Gower of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles landed with B Company. By the end of the day, only he and 26 others remained standing out of the roughly 120 who'd come ashore that morning. Roughly 1 in 5. And those survivors didn't retreat. They didn't break. They consolidated and prepared for the counterattacks they knew were coming. And when the German 21st Panzer Division attacked the next day, those survivors, the ghosts of B Company, stopped the panzers cold. This is what made the Canadian effort on D-Day so remarkable. It wasn't just that they fought hard. It wasn't just that they advanced further than any other troops that day. It was that they did all of this while sustaining casualties that would have broken lesser units. A unit that loses 1/3 of its strength in the first few hours is typically considered combat ineffective. The Canadians didn't have that luxury. There was no one else to take their sector. There was no backup plan. Either they held Juno Beach or the invasion failed. So they held it. They held it and then pushed beyond it because that's what Canadians do. The story of June 7th is less famous than the chaos of June 6th, but it might be more important. Because on June 7th, the Canadians were supposed to be consolidating. They were supposed to be digging in, catching their breath, receiving reinforcements. Instead, they went on the attack again. They captured Carpiquet Airfield, a crucial objective that had seemed days away just 24 hours earlier. They pushed the German 716th Division so hard that it ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Officers and NCOs were killed or captured, and the remaining men scattered, looking for any unit willing to take them in. The division that had manned the Atlantic Wall with such ferocity the day before was simply gone. That rapid collapse created a cascade of failures in the German command structure. With the 716th shattered, there were gaps in the line. The 21st Panzer Division, held back as a mobile reserve, was thrown into those gaps to stabilize the front. They ran into Canadian positions and were fought to a standstill. Then the British units broke through. Then American units started making progress. The whole thing started to unravel, and it all traced back to that moment on Juno Beach when those Canadian boys refused to break. You have to understand what D-Day represented to Canada. It wasn't just another operation. It was vindication. It was proof. It was the answer to every slight, every dismissal, every moment when a British officer had looked past a Canadian in the room. When the casualty figures came in, when the officers submitted their after-action reports, when the historians started writing about the invasion, Canada's contribution couldn't be ignored or minimized. The numbers were simply too big. The achievement was simply too real. Ernest "Smoky" Smith's Victoria Cross became a symbol of that achievement. A 20-year-old from Vancouver, a boy who'd grown up in a country that most of the world barely acknowledged, and he'd done something so brave, so decisive, that his nation's highest military honor was insufficient to properly recognize it. He deserved a parade. He deserved a monument. Instead, he went back home, went back to his job, and lived a quiet life. That was the Canadian way. Don't talk about it. Don't make a fuss. You did your job. Move on. But history has a way of preserving these moments, and history will not let Ernest Smith's sacrifice fade into obscurity. The same goes for Charlie Martin and the Queen's Own Rifles. Martin carried a wounded sergeant 2 miles through mortar fire. That's not a tactical decision. That's not a military maneuver. That's a man deciding that he's not going to lose someone he cares about, and he's willing to die trying to save them. How many men would do that in the moment? How many people do you know who'd carry another person's weight through a war zone? And how many would do it and then, when asked about it later, just shrug and say, "I couldn't leave him"? That's the Canadian spirit right there. Not arrogance. Not swagger. Just a quiet certainty that you do what needs to be done, and you don't make a big production about it. It's a spirit born from the landscape they come from a country so large and so harsh that it teaches you self-reliance and humility in equal measure. You learn to work hard because nothing else will survive. You learn to help your neighbors because their survival means the survival of the community. You learn that talking about doing something is the same as not doing it, only the doing matters. The legacy of Juno Beach transformed Canada. It transformed how Canadians saw themselves and how the world saw Canadians. Before D-Day, Canada was a helpful subsidiary, a junior partner in the British Empire. After D-Day, Canada was a proven military power. The government in Ottawa could negotiate with Washington and London as equals. Canadian units were requested by name for dangerous missions. Canadian military doctrine was studied in other nations' war colleges. And most importantly, Canadian soldiers learned that they belonged at the table with the best in the world. This realization had consequences that extended far beyond World War II. It shaped Canada's foreign policy for the rest of the 20th century. It influenced Canada's decision to maintain a strong military during the Cold War. It led to Canadian involvement in peacekeeping operations around the world, because if Canadians could do it at Juno Beach, they could do it anywhere. It created a national identity built on the certainty that Canadians could achieve great things when called upon, and that belief has proven remarkably durable. The numbers from June 6th and 7th tell the story. Roughly 14,000 Canadian troops landed at Juno Beach that day. By the end of those 2 days, they'd suffered over 1,200 casualties, a casualty rate of about 1 in 12. In military terms, that's catastrophic. But what they'd accomplished in exchange for those casualties was transformational. They'd defeated an entire German division. They'd created gaps in the enemy line that other Allied units quickly exploited. They'd advanced further inland than any other troops that day. And they'd done it with equipment that was sometimes inferior to what British and American units carried, with training that was less formal, with leadership that was questioned by the establishment they served. When the war ended and the guns fell silent, when the men came home and tried to build new lives, they carried these memories with them. Not as trauma exactly, though it certainly was traumatic, but as a kind of knowledge. They knew what they were capable of. They knew that they could push through pain and fear and exhaustion and accomplish things that seemed impossible. They knew that when everything was on the line, they'd shown up and done the job. That knowledge became part of the Canadian character. It manifested in the post-war years as a kind of quiet confidence. Canadians didn't swagger. They didn't boast. But they knew. The British generals who'd mocked the colonial troops never fully apologized, because that wasn't the British way. But Montgomery's words in his final dispatch spoke volumes. Consistently shown a fighting quality and a determination that has been an inspiration to all Allied forces. That's not the language you use for auxiliary troops. That's not what you write about soldiers you've underestimated. That's an acknowledgement of something that can't be taken back or minimized. The Canadians had proven themselves beyond any possible doubt. And the men who did it? Most of them came home and never spoke about it again. They didn't join veterans organizations. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't seek recognition or compensation. They simply moved on. They went back to their farms and built something. They worked in factories and provided for their families. They had children who grew up never quite understanding what their parents had done, because their parents wouldn't talk about it. There's a dignity in that silence, a recognition that some things are too important to be reduced to stories. The doing is everything. The telling is secondary. But we tell the story anyway because we must. Because if we don't preserve these memories, if we don't remind ourselves of what was sacrificed, then we risk forgetting the lesson that those Canadian boys learned on Juno Beach. The lesson that underestimation is dangerous. The lesson that the people you overlook might be the ones who change everything. The lesson that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about pushing through fear because something matters more than your own safety. On May 5th every year, Dutch children wave Canadian flags. On June 6th, ceremonies are held at Juno Beach to remember those who fell. On November 11th, Canadians take a moment of silence to honor those who didn't come home. These aren't just rituals. They're acts of remembrance that prevent these young men from being forgotten, that ensure their sacrifice remains part of the national consciousness. Because if we forget, we diminish them. If we move on and build our comfortable lives without acknowledging the price that was paid for our freedom, then we insult them. The story of Juno Beach is ultimately about something profoundly human. It's about people doing extraordinary things not because they were born extraordinary, but because circumstances demanded it and they responded. It's about a young country finding its voice and declaring to the world that it belonged at the table with the great powers. It's about a military that was mocked and underestimated, proving through sheer determination and courage that the mocking was a mistake. And it's about the individual stories, the names and faces and small acts of heroism that history rarely records but that made all the difference. It's about the medic who bandaged wounds until his hands wouldn't work anymore. It's about the engineer who cleared mines while people shot at him. It's about the young man who saw his friends die and kept going anyway because stopping wasn't an option. It's about the sergeant who carried his men through hell because that's what sergeants do. It's about the private who destroyed tanks with a gun that looked like it couldn't possibly work, but he made it work because he had to. These stories matter now, 80 years later, in a world that seems smaller and more connected and yet somehow more fragmented. We still face the temptation to underestimate people. We still judge based on where someone's from or how they sound or what background they come from. We still assume that the people who've been overlooked must have deserved to be overlooked. And Juno Beach stands as a monument to how wrong that assumption can be. The Canadian soldiers who landed on D-Day went home and built a nation. They didn't brag about it. They didn't demand recognition. They simply worked, and that work, combined with the work of millions of others, transformed the world. They proved that a small nation punching above its weight isn't just possible, it's powerful. They proved that courage isn't the exclusive property of the great powers. They proved that when the moment comes and you're called upon to do something impossible, you might just find that you can do it. And 80 years later, their sacrifice still speaks. It still tells us something about who we are and what we're capable of. It still reminds us that history isn't made by the famous or the powerful or the ones everyone expected. It's made by young men and women willing to stand up and do what needs to be done. It's made by people who refuse to break even when everything suggests they should. It's made by Canadians on a beach in Normandy, showing the world what they were made of. The British generals mocked the Canadian soldiers. And then they saw what those soldiers could do when given the chance. That lesson, the danger of underestimation, the power of determination, the capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, that lesson is the real victory of D-Day. Not the territory gained or the enemies killed, but the reminder that potential exists in unexpected places and in unexpected people. And when you give those people their moment, when you finally take them seriously, they might just change everything.